And most of them that I've seen, there's a long rod that goes through the whole length of all these keys. So you want to use this screwdriver in the end, and it comes out from the bottom, and you put the screwdriver in and you hold the joint where you're not going to, like, you don't want to hold it here and have the screwdriver slip and go into your fingers. Like you can see, I've done that so many times, and that's just today and yesterday. And so you want to hold it where the screwdriver won't go and poke you. I've poked myself with springs and screwdrivers and all kinds of stuff so much. So when you hold it, put the screwdriver in the end of the rod and hold it around, so if it slips, it won't go into your finger or your hand. And then just start turning it out. So you want to hold it and you want to back out that rod until it stops, which means you've come to the end of the threads that are holding it in. And it won't, you can do this all day with the screwdriver, keep turning and turning, and it won't come out any further. So then you get your pliers and you grab that rod perpendicular. Pliers have a couple jaws that are angled, right? So here are the jaws of your pliers, like that. And here is the rod. Okay? So if you grab it parallel to the rod, see what tiny area is touching the pliers? It's not much. But when you put the pliers across, you're holding that whole rod. And that's what you want. You want to hold the rod perpendicular. So you've got surface area of the pliers on surface area of the rod. If you do it like this,
it'll wreck it.
Yeah, if you do it like this, you're not grabbing much at all. And then you can also, you want to be careful that you don't grab it hard and close the slot in the end of the rod.
Perpendicular to the slot too.
Yeah, if you can get it there. That's not so critical in doing this. If it's really stuck, then you want to be careful. But you always want to do the rod and the pliers perpendicular to each other. And then, if you find it's not coming out easily, just get your spring hook, and you have crochet hooks as spring hooks. Just unhook the spring so that it's not pushing the rod, the hinge tube. That's called a hinge tube, and this is called a hinge rod. This is a hinge tube, and this is a hinge rod. So that when that spring is on there, it's actually pushing that tube against that rod. So it may be harder to pull out. So just unhook the spring, and then it'll be easier to pull out. And you've got, most of you, unless you have a C foot, just have 3 keys on the foot joint. Probably you guys have C foots, right? Yeah, so, because you're good flute players. I'm not so good a flute player. I studied flute when I was in college, but I got no fingers anymore. I can make a sound, but no technique. So you take those keys off, and you've got 3 keys. You've got one, the low C pad. I haven't seen a B foot in a while, so if some of you have a B foot, you might want to show. But this rod goes through, you've got 2 tubes on this one. And you want to make sure that the rod goes easily through both tubes. And if I clean it off...
Chris, what brand is the one you're working on?
This is a Blessing.
Okay.
The Blessing closed hole flute. So I'm going to clean the rod off, and I'm going to clean the hinge tubes. And I've got some pipe cleaners with bristles, but you can use plain pipe cleaners. I don't think that's on your list. I apologize. I think of things all the time after the fact. But to clean out the tubes, you can use pipe cleaners. So I'm cleaning out the hinge tubes and I've wiped off the rod. Now I'm going to see if this rod will fall. Well, it's not quite. It's falling through the upper tube, but not, it's going through the lower tube, but it's not quite falling through. Ideally, I would like that to fall through. So I may want to take some time and try to align those tubes. But it's pretty close. I mean, when the key moves like this, if you can spin that key on those tubes, you're in pretty good shape. So that's kind of your goal. If you find that rod you can't just go like this and push it through, then you've got to align those tubes. And you'll see that a lot on saxophone because you've got a lot of double things. But on flute, this is basically the only one. The other rods on the flute, those are fun. They get bent and they get messed up. But it's a whole different assembly. So this is what you want to think about with this down in the foot joint. Also on the end of this, there's a roller that's held on with another rod. So you can take that roller off. Take the rod out. Clean the roller. Clean the rod. Just wipe it off with a cloth. Get pipe cleaner or something and clean the inside of the roller. Then put the roller back in there, roller on there, and then put it back on the key. Now, some rollers on some flutes, if you tighten the rod down too much, the roller binds. So you just have to back it off to where the roller still moves. And then, of course, you want to lubricate it. So get your oil, your pin or your needle, and then put the oil at the base of the roller there, and it'll work its way up. You can put a little bit on the other end too. It depends on how the rod is shaped. You're going to find some different shapes on different flutes. And you can put a little oil on it before you put it back in as well. It just is a little messier. And then, of course, move it, make sure it's free, and wipe off the excess. Everybody, also, when you have it apart, look at all the pads. You want to make sure that the pads aren't split. You want to make sure all the retaining screws and plates are in there. A lot of times these get loose and go missing, and that means the pad won't be held in. So make sure those are tight. Just tight, not squashing tight, because they'll squash the pad down enough. Just make sure there's in there securely. You don't want to really press them in hard. What we're looking at is the way the flute is put together, because you're gonna be taking them apart and putting them together to work on them better. So and if you haven't taken it apart before, you're seeing what's going on. And the foot joint is really pretty easy. It's the rest of it that's kind of a problem, but we'll get there. But this is a basic idea. The spring, I'm going to pin my video so I can see what I'm showing you. Okay, you notice the spring is bent this way. Okay, it's bent this direction, so that when I press the key down, it presses that direction. It presses against that spring, so the spring pushes back. So when I hook that spring, you see what direction it is. When I hook it on the catch, then it's going to press. See where it is? Now it pushes the key back open. Okay? They have to be bent that way in order to function. And do you see how this one's bent here? See it? So when I put that key on, and when I press that key down, it's pressing against that, and then that spring pushes the key back open. And they have to be bent like that in order to function. These springs tend not to rust, but they can still break. And if you bend it really hard at the post, you can break it. So be careful when you bend it. So when you put it back together, put a little oil on it. I put the rod in part way, and I'll put a little key oil at the pivot point. And then I'll put a little oil on the rod itself, so that when I put the rod into the tubes, it's lubricating the insides of the tubes. So you start from the bottom, you put the C key on. Then the next one is the one that goes in the middle. It's got the bumper or the place there. Set that in there. You can catch the spring if you want, but you have enough room to use your spring hook to catch it after it's on. Then you run the rod up through those two. And you use the table as a hand, and you manipulate this key to line it up with the rod. The hinge tubes have to line up or the rod won't go through. And if you get things off at an angle, you have to line them up. Those tubes have to be parallel. They have to be lined up. And then this is free because the spring isn't hooked. So now I'm going to hook the spring, and the spring should fit in the little slot in the spring catch, so it functions properly. Then you want to test it and make sure it moves, and you want to make sure the C moves. And then you've got one more key. Now this one's sprung where it's closed all the time. So you want to, if you want to, you can catch that spring with the key. Then push the rod in all the way till it stops. And then on all the rods, you want to get the screwdriver and you want to turn it backward until you feel a little click. That means you've seated the thread, and then turn it in. You don't want to force it, because if you cross thread it, you've got more problems. And then check that motion, make sure that spring is hooked. Check the other two. Then get some key oil. Oil the other pivot points. And I'm cheating. I'm doing it like I normally do because I've done it for years. I'm putting it on from the bottle. But don't do that. Do as I say, not as I do. Then work the oil in. Wipe off the excess. And you've got a reassembled foot joint.